Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I know that there's fewer of us, but I think the microphone is very helpful for everyone to hear. I thank you for coming. If you are hungry, we have snacks and water. Please feel free to grab as much of those as you would like. And if you have a chance, please sign in. Just helps us kind of understand where you all are coming from. I hope you enjoy your evening tonight. I also want to make a special mention that in the back there we have representation from Be Smart, and we have a table from the Round Lake Beach Police Department, and their goal is to be present to have any conversations you would like about firearm safety and anything else safety related that you'd like to talk with them about. So welcome to both of you. I'm super excited to introduce our guest speaker tonight. He is a licensed clinical psychologist and has served most of his career, about 20 years, as the principal and a psychologist at the North Shore Academy, which is a private therapeutic day school for students in grades kindergarten through 12th grade. He has been a wonderful support to our district staff this year in providing staff development for our district staff family. So we are super excited to share him with you. Please help me welcome Dr. Doug Bolton. Who's drinking? Good timing. Here you go.
Thank you, Heather. It's great to be here. And it's really, I think it's wonderful when staff and parents are sharing the same learning. And so everything that I'm going to be doing today is stuff we've been doing with your teachers and the teams. And so I'm excited when we can all begin to have the same language. But, you know, as we dive in, and I'm sorry to talk about COVID a little bit, but it's hard to talk about mental health now without talking about COVID. It's hard to talk about resilience without talking about COVID. But really, my hope is that we've survived this storm, and it's time to begin thinking about what happens after the storm. And I can remember wondering, kind of as COVID was starting, and I felt really lost, wondering, I wish there was somebody who'd been through something like this so that they could guide me and us. And I realized there was somebody. It was my grandmother. She was born in 1899. She died about 35 years ago. But when I thought about her life, I wished that she was around because I think she could have given me some real guidance. When she was just 7, there was a typhoid fever outbreak. And then when she was 15, it was World War I. And then 2 years after that started, there was a polio outbreak. And then we all know about the Spanish flu. Think about all this before the age of 20. And then the Roaring 20s came. I love this picture. It doesn't look like a stock photo, that's her, right? All dressed up. And the Roaring 20s hit, and she met my grandfather, Walt. And a few years later, they married, they had their only son, my dad. We all know what happens after that, don't we? When the Great Depression hits. And then what comes after that, World War II. It's like it just never stopped, right? And once World War II ended, as if this wasn't enough for my grandmother, just 2 years after the war ended, my grandfather died. And yet, when my parents were divorced, who was the person who showed up for us? Who was the person who was resilient for us? I never heard any of these stories of hardship that she went through. All I know is she cared for us. She had her way with kids, didn't she? She'd hate it if she knew that I was sharing this photo, but I love this photo. She hung with us even in our worst moments, right? What do we call this generation of people who survived a pandemic, a depression, and 2 world wars? We call them the greatest generation, don't we? I wonder what we're going to call this generation of kids who've gone through so much. So what do? I want history to be our guide. There were plagues before, weren't there? The Black Plague in the 14th century was the worst. It took 1 out of every 3 European lives. Can you imagine every family of 6 lost on average 2 people. And then we already talked about the Spanish flu, which makes COVID pale in comparison. The Spanish flu took between 50 and 100 million lives. In each of these times, when there is a pandemic, the world turns upside down, and each time we move from pain to possibility, don't we? What came after the Black Plague? The Renaissance. The worst pandemic led to the greatest developments in our cultural history. What happened? And we've already talked about this. After the Spanish flu came the Roaring '20s. It's almost like there's this incubation period when everything shuts down. When we come out, we begin to see the world differently. When things fall apart, we rebuild and we reconnect. And this is the power of families. Recovery is our superpower as a species. And in these moments, we come and we can't help but think differently. That every time this disruption has led to innovation. And so the question is, what will we change? As parents, what will we change as schools? What will we change in our society? And the truth is that there was a mental health epidemic before COVID. We can't forget that. Life was hard for so many kids pre-pandemic, wasn't it? Here are just a couple of statistics. The decade before COVID, rates of depression rose more than 60% in our kids. And the number of kids and teenagers who were seen in emergency rooms for suicidal thoughts or attempts doubled. And here's the thing that's scariest for me as an educator and as a parent. My kids are through middle school, through high school, but the suicide rate for children is 2 times higher when school is in session. There's something about the pressure we're putting on kids. It's pushing many kids to the edge. And it's not about the weather. For adults, the suicide rate is higher in the summer. And then, right before COVID, a study came out and said that students in high-achieving schools like District 46, just attending District 46 puts you at risk. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation named the top environmental conditions harming adolescent wellness. Among them were poverty, trauma, discrimination, and an excessive pressure to excel. So this is what's happening. So my hope is, I like what Winston Churchill said. He said, never let a good crisis go to waste. Our kids are in crisis. Let's take full advantage of this time. And so one of the ways that schools are doing this, you guys have heard of social emotional learning, you might guess, right? So social emotional learning is really quite simple conceptually, but I think it's really, really important. This is CASEL, and CASEL is the main people doing research on social emotional learning are in Chicago, an organization called CASEL. They say there are 5 competencies for social emotional learning. There's self-awareness and self-management, there's social awareness and relationship skills. And if we do all those things, then we make our best decisions, don't we? There's a guy who does remarkable work in research on resilience and trauma. His name is Bruce Perry. And he says we need to be regulated and related in order to access our best brains. Now, when we have theories that dovetail, it tells me we're onto something. Take a look. Regulation is all about being aware of what's happening in my bodies and my thoughts, and then being able to manage it. Do I have the skills to manage what's happening for me? Relationship skills are all about social awareness, and then being able to have the skills to be able to navigate those tricky parts of relationships, and then we can access reason. So one of the things that have you guys seen this as parents, the zones of regulation? This is something that a lot of schools are using. So what it does is it says, what zone are you in? Are you in the blue zone? Are you feeling sad, tired, bored? I hope you're not bored yet, all right? Are you in the green zone, happy, calm, I'm ready to learn, I'm in my happy space, right? Yellow zone is I'm stressed, I don't know if my kids are okay at home tonight, right? And red zone is I'm about to throw something, I'm so angry. So I want you to take a minute, and I want you to share with a partner. If you're sitting alone, you can just think about it yourself. What zone are you in right now? And I think you can be If you're a little tired because it's the end of the day, but you're anxious about something, you can be in the below zone. I don't care. We don't have to limit it to 4 zones. But what zone are you in? And then, what do you need? Right? Do you need something to eat? Do you need to get up and move? Do you have a sore back and you're going to need to stand and walk? I'm okay with any of those things. I'm going to need to be checking my phone because I want to make sure my child made it home from the game tonight. Whatever that looks like. So, what do you need? What zone are you in? And what do you need? Share that with a partner. All right. So I won't give you too much time for this, but the beautiful thing is one little thing, one little moment, 90 seconds. It's at what zone am I in? It's self-awareness. What do I need? How am I going to manage that? And then by knowing what someone else is going through, you've got social awareness. We had just hit 3 out of the 5, right? All in just a minute. It doesn't have to be more complex than that. And so here's the thing that Kessel also talks about, and the thing that I would be thinking about as parents, is in order for us to have good social-emotional learning in our kids, they say first build a plan, and then we've got to focus on adult SEL. We've got to get our own house in order before we can help our kids address their SEL. We can't help our children if we aren't aware of what's happening ourselves. Our regulation has to come first. I worked with the Highland Park teachers right before the kids came back to school, and they were very concerned about what's going to happen in our classrooms. How do we help support them in this hardest moment this community maybe ever has faced? And I worked with a trauma expert. Her name is Mary Jo Barrett. And she shared this with me. And with them. She says, this is what we need to do. She says, our world, everything, every living thing expands and contracts. That if we are, we work a hard work day and then you come here tonight and then hopefully you'll get some sleep tonight. And then tomorrow you work a full day. We work and then we contract and then the next day we expand and we contract. Sports teams, they play a half and then they contract and slow down and reflect and catch their breath for halftime and then they go out and do it again. The seasons we have, there's rhythm to the seasons. All of these things happen. But in order to expand, we've got to contract first. Nobody would say it's a good idea for me to say, I'm going to be really productive this week. I'm going to not sleep all week. I'm going to sleep on the weekend so I can be really productive. We would never say that. Because there's this rhythm that we've got to get into where we expand and contract, that we slow down and we pause and we give ourselves those opportunities to pause. And the challenge, one of the big challenges that we're facing now, is that kids' lives have been expanding but not contracting, haven't they? And the less time we give kids to contract, the less time we give them to catch their breath, the less they're going to be able to be successful. The more stress they're going to experience. And it's not just our kids. You guys are having to do this as well. And so all of a sudden, and teachers' lives are having to do this as well. And then what's happening is kids are starting to fall apart. Many kids are struggling. And I want to think about their struggles through the lens of behavior. One of the things that's been happening is that we have been seeing behavior through one single lens. It's motivation, right? And if behavior is motivation, then we got 2 choices. We can use a carrot or stick. We can use an incentive or punishment, right? The problem is we've been ignoring research for over 150 years about behavior. We've had this research. And so I want to talk about a new way to understand behavior. There's a guy, so behaviorism, it all started in the early 1920s with this guy named John Watson. He's the father of behaviorism. He wrote a book, and I'd like to see where these theories begin. So here we go. Here's the second chapter of his book was titled The Dangers of Too Much Mother Love. He wrote, when you're tempted to pet your child, remember that a mother's love is a dangerous instrument, which may inflict a never-healing wound, a wound which may make infancy unhappy, adolescence a nightmare, an instrument which may wreck your adult son or daughter's vocational future and their chances for marital happiness. Do not give your child affection, right? Seems ridiculous, doesn't it, now? And yet, what do we say when our kids misbehave? Don't give them any attention. It's only it's gonna spoil them. It's gonna make things worse. B.F. Skinner came along, and he created the Skinner box. What he did was he got rats to do amazing things by just giving them pellets. It was incredible, the research he was able to do. He said, give me a child and I will shape him into anything. So it becomes about reinforcements and punishments. And this is how our beliefs for over a century have been. This is how we get kids to behave. And don't get me wrong, behavioral interventions can control behavior. You put a gun to my head, and there's a lot of stuff I'm gonna do that I wouldn't otherwise do. You say you're gonna give me $5 million? I might push some things I wouldn't otherwise push, but here's the thing. They may work sometimes, but there's a cost. And the things we do to get the most out of our kids is often counterproductive because what they do is they shut our brains down. And then all of a sudden what we're focused on is what's the punishment we're gonna get? Or what is the carrot we're gonna reach for? And our brains go from being very reflective, thoughtful people to being very focused on only one thing. I had done all this research, and I knew all this research. And then I walked into a spin class. Has anyone ever taken a spin class? I see some nodding. So I get in there, and there's about 12 people on bikes, and the trainer says, I'll tell you what, the person with the most watts gets a prize. Didn't tell us what the prize was. But the watts is essentially a measure of who's working the hardest, right? It's like how fast you're pedaling with how much resistance is on the flywheel. So I'm an old guy. I really just need to get my heart rate up and make sure they don't need to get the paddles out, right? Like that's my goal for working out. But all of a sudden I look around and I think I can take these people. And so I start pedaling, and I am pedaling and pedaling. And we get to the end, and I think 3 or 4 people need to pull me off of the bike, right? And I couldn't exercise for another 3 or 4 days. I didn't feel well, right? I stopped sweating maybe after 4 hours. And I didn't win. I came in 7th, right? So that was a little embarrassing. And then, when this all hit me, when they told us what the prize was, and this is a true story. This is a sports bra. Here I was, I just saw this shiny prize in front of me and thought, I can win, I can get this. And everything about what was healthy for me went away. One of the things that I think is, one of the reasons why I think behaviorism became such a big deal was because just as Watson was discovering and documenting his behavioral theories, Henry Ford was developing the assembly line. And it works on the assembly line, because you don't have to think. If we don't need people to think, incentives and punishments work really well. But punishments rely on fear and shame. And with incentives, we do the right things for the wrong reasons. Reading's good for young kids. We can all agree on that, right? And the good news is that if we give them an incentive to read like this over the summer, they read more. Sounds pretty good, right? Here's the problem. When they go back and follow these kids up the following summer, when they no longer are getting a prize, an incentive, they read less. And I think even worse, they report enjoying reading less than kids who never got the incentive. Barry Schwartz says, incentives and punishment demoralize what is otherwise a moral act. They change the question in people's minds from, is this right or wrong, to is this worth the price? In Israel, they had an organization that had 20 daycare facilities, and people were showing up late. Can you believe parents would show up late to pick their kids up from childcare? Crazy, right? So what they did was they decided, all right, we are going to fine people for being late, but we're only going to do it for half the people, for half the organizations. So they had 10 of them they had the fine, the other 10 they didn't have the fine. They wanted to see what was the impact of the fine. Did it help? It made a huge difference in the opposite way they expected. So they took baseline data between week 1 and week 5, and then they implemented the fine. And look at this. This is the people who received the fine. This is the number of people showing up late with the fine. It doubled. How does that make sense? Any ideas? You mean I'm going to get fined $10 for showing up late to pick up my kid? That means that I only have to pay $10 and I can go have happy hour with my colleagues? You mean I can go grocery shopping and not have my kid in the cart? Life is good, right? So all of a sudden they started doing this, but one of the things that happened, look at week 17. They took it away week 17, they stopped the fine, and yet the behavior didn't change, because once we start making something transactional, it's very hard to bring it back. So these ways that we typically are managing behavior, our kids' worst moments, can really be counterproductive. One of the things that happens is incentives and punishments focus us on what's best for me right now. And they take away what's best for other people. It takes away kids' sense of morality. Even B.F. Skinner said a person who's been punished is not less inclined to behave in a given way. At best, he learns how to avoid punishment. Is that true for us as adults? It's true for me, right? Last time you caught me speeding, right? I didn't say, oh, I'm so sorry, I was driving unsafely for my other riders in this community. No, I said, I'm gonna make sure I get my Waze app up so that I can know when you're sitting there for me, right? This is what we do. Or, as Funky Little Diva says, when I'm in the naughty corner, I don't spend my time thinking about what I've done wrong. I plan on how to do it the next time without getting caught. This is what happens when we engage in this way of managing kids' hardest moments. I had a lot of hard moments with my son Matthew. He was, I wasn't sure, this is his graduation day from high school, and I wasn't sure we were gonna make it. He had a hard high school. He would struggle to get his work done, and then he'd feel ashamed that he didn't get his work done, so he'd skip class. Or he'd scribble it out right before he went in, so he'd be late, and we'd walk into class late. So what do you do with kids who are late to class in high school and middle school, or skip class? Detentions, right? So how many detentions would you give Matthew? I'll cut to the chase, it didn't work for Matthew. But one of the things about punishments is we keep doing them even if they don't work, don't we? Grounding doesn't work. Well, you're grounded for 6 weeks now, right? So how many detentions would you give Matthew before you realized we gotta try something else? Some people say 3, people say 5, right? So Matthew, the week before graduation, he comes to me, and he's still in school. He's got like 3 days left of school. He says, Dad, I achieved something I didn't think I was ever going to achieve. I'm like, National Honor Society, right? Like, he's smart, right? He just couldn't get his work in. I'm like, yeah, maybe you're speaking of graduation. Kids, they like you, right? He said, Dad, I hit 500. This is his detention detail report. He only did 466. So guess what that means? That means he can't go to prom. How does that make any sense? Are they worried he's going to be late for his date? Right? How is that connected? He couldn't go to Great America. I would go to his parent-teacher conferences, and I would carry his shame just for about 2 hours every semester. He had to carry it every day. I can remember every time I'd speak to a teacher, they'd say, really nice kid, but he's not coming to class, he's way behind on his work, he's got a 35%, he's got a 42%. Here's all the work he needs to make up. And I just felt this weight. And one day I was walking down the hallway and somebody, the teacher pokes her head out of the classroom and said, "Are you Matthew's dad?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "I love Matthew." And I said, "I love you? Who are you? I don't get it. Like, I don't know. No one ever talks about him this way." And she said, "I'm his detention supervisor. I see him every day. He's the nicest kid." He did get recognized by his classmates. Detentions didn't work for him. You know why? Because the underlying issue was his executive functioning problems. And detentions don't fix executive functioning problems, do they? In 2011, 3.5 million students were suspended, more than double in 1975. Now, isn't this supposed to be a deterrent that keeps people from getting suspended? Why would it double if it was working? This one shocked me. I had to look at it a bunch of times. There's a 76.6% 5-year recidivism rate following release from state prisons. People who have experienced state prison end up reoffending, 75% of them. If it was just motivation, would they keep going back? No, there's something more to the picture, isn't there? One of the things that's in this picture is that 97% of people who are incarcerated have experienced significant trauma. We've got to deal with both. I want to say it's not all or nothing. There are times when we need to be able to say, if we want something to work quick and we've got to get out of the house or we've got to get this to happen, yes, these things can work well, but let's understand the limitations and the impact, and let's start to marry this science with the practice. Behaviorism is a part of all aspects of our society, but it began with animal research. And take a look at what even the animal researchers say. That Franz de Waal is one of the leaders in primatology. He says, neuroscience is breaking open the black box to look inside the brain, offering accounts of how animals solve problems and rely less and less on learning theories of the past. Behaviorism is dying a slow death, lifting its head only now and then to feebly try putting a brake on these developments. Even animal researchers say this doesn't work. So what do we do instead? If that's not going to be the thing that creates the change in our kids, that supports our kids in their hardest moments, what do we do? So I want to talk about emotional regulation. Because I think that if we had been talking about emotional regulation for the last 100 years, our kids would be in a different place. So let's start talking about your emotional regulation. Think of the last time you lost your temper. What did you look like? What did you sound like? What dumb thing did you say or do? Am I the only one who looks really bad in these moments, right? I'm glad there are some other people who are saying this. So the question is, why is it? We're good people. We're smart people. Why is it that we do such stupid things in these moments? And the key thing is what's happening in our kids' worst moments are the same things that are happening in our worst moments. So I talked about there being research from 150 years ago. It all started with Phineas Gage in 1848. Phineas Gage was not a scientist, he was not a doctor. Phineas Gage was a railroad worker. And his job was to blow holes in the side of the Vermont countryside so they could lay tracks. And he would drill a hole, he'd put some explosive in there, put some rocks down, tamp it down, light a fuse, step back, and it would blow up. Well, he had a really bad day one day, and he was tamping down the rocks, and a spark must have caught the explosive, and the explosive, his tamping rod went up through his chin, through underneath his cheek, and up the top of his skull. And it blew through that part of his brain, the prefrontal cortex. The amazing thing is he was able, after he was done, the tamping rod landed 20 feet away, but he was able to stand up. And they got him on a carriage, and they took him into town. He was able to talk. He even had a sense of humor. He said, when the doctor finally came, he said, "Doctor, here's business enough for you. You've got a lot of work to do here." And he made almost a complete physical recovery. He lost his left eye, but otherwise, he had all of his language. He had all of his physical motor abilities, and yet the doctor described him as fitful and irreverent, indulging at times in the greatest profanity. This sounds like me when I'm melting down, right? Capricious and vacillating and being radically changed so decidedly that his friends and acquaintances said he was no longer Gage. What they knew, what we've known since 1848, is that this part of the brain has a huge impact on the kinds of things that kids who struggle the most with being resilient, kids who struggle the most in their worst moments with their behavior. When you think about your child and the challenges you have, my guess is that this captures the essence of what the challenges are. Robert Sapolsky, he's a neuroscientist. I like this. He says it makes you do the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. It makes you write an outline when you feel like just quickly rushing through something. It makes you get up off the couch to make dinner when you really feel like watching one more episode of Netflix, right? It makes you bite your tongue when you feel like saying that thing that you shouldn't say. It helps you not punch your sister when she takes something precious from you. So what we know now is that behavior problems are about brain development, not motivation. And here's the thing, there's this myth that we are primarily rational beings. We are not rational beings, we are survival beings. Our brains are built for survival. And this is very simplistic, but I think it can be helpful. The three different parts of the brain, there's the cortex, that green part. There's the limbic system, the yellow core part in the middle of the brain, and then there's the brainstem. That is the most primitive part of our brain. It connects to our nervous system. And they each have different tasks for us. The thinking, rational part of our brain, that's our cortex. The limbic system is really the part of our brain that says, I'm safe or not safe. And what it'll do is, if I'm not safe, then it'll trigger my stress response. It'll trigger fight or flight, right? So what keeps us from accessing the cortex? Stress does. And stress pushes us into fight or flight. And what happens in fight or flight? When we lose access to the cortex, when we go into lower brain, we lose some very important things we need in order to solve the problems that we're facing right then. Think about the last time you melted down. How good a listener were you? We lose the capacity to be creative. Have you ever noticed how inflexible you can get when you're stressed? We lose empathy. All of these things. If we're getting chased by a grizzly bear, it's not helpful to be able to say, oh, I hope he doesn't run away. I hope he doesn't get scratched, right? That doesn't help us. It doesn't help us to be flexible. We need to choose one thing and go with it, right? I've been married for a long time, and never once in an argument, we've had a couple of arguments, never once have I said, honey, let me listen to you. Right, I'm doing all the talking. That doesn't happen in my house. I want to be that guy. Right, I don't say, hey, I can be flexible this time. Let's do it your way. Over time, I can get there, but not in that moment. Have you ever noticed, at least for me, language, sometimes you're so upset. Have you ever been so upset that you're angry, that you can't find any language? You just can't find the words, right? Or, if you're like me, the only words you can think of are 4 letters long. Right? And you feel like you've got to yell them for some reason, right? And then inhibition. It's really hard for us. We get very impulsive in these moments. This happens for all of us. And what do we ask kids to do? We ask them when they are stressed, what do we say? We say, listen to us. We say, find another solution to this problem. We say, the world doesn't rotate around you. We say, you need to take the perspective of other people, don't we? We say, what happened? They remember something very different than we do. That's because we don't encode these things in our brain. Language. Tell me what's going on. And they yell it, or they don't have the words. We say, stop doing that, and they keep doing that. I can't do this any better than they can do that in the moment. My brain's not allowing me to do that, and they can't get access to those parts of their brain. And so in these moments, we are flooded with all sorts of changes that happen. Our breathing rate increases, so we can get more oxygen into our bloodstream. Our blood flow goes to our skeletal muscles so we can fight and flee, right? Our blood sugar levels increase so we have more energy. Our pupils dilate so we can see danger. Our intestinal muscles relax. Why would that be helpful? Like, that's the last thing I'd want to have happen, right? Like, I'm running from a grizzly bear and I got to worry about that? The interesting thing is the body shuts down anything that's going to use too much energy. Our cortex is 2% of our body mass, but takes up 20% of our energy. So we shut the functioning down of our brain, and our digestive system also is the second biggest system, energy user. And so we're full brain, lower brain. We're regulated or dysregulated, but at the end of the day, I heard someone say, it's like we've lost 30 IQ points. We just are dumber, aren't we, in these moments? And 30 IQ points seems a little generous. I'd go 40 for me, right? If you took a brain scan of me when I'm melting down, I think it would look like this, right? That's what it feels like. And here's the thing. When there's a dysregulated child, there's a dysregulated adult. It's really hard to sit with someone who's dysregulated and stay regulated yourself. It's really hard, but here's the thing. Dysregulation is highly contagious, but then all of a sudden they've lost 30 IQ points, and you've lost your 30 IQ points. Together you're down 60 IQ points. I would say this is not a good time to solve a problem, right? And yet we feel this urgency to solve it now, don't we? And it almost never ends up good for us. So what does lower brain look like? Well, it looks like that, right? But it also looks like this. Oppositional behavior, right? Spacing out, feeling stressed. There are also some kids who are so anxious about doing everything right. And then all of a sudden they seem to have, they're getting all the great grades, but if they're so worried about making a mistake, all of a sudden you find out that girl down the street who's doing so well is now, or boy is now in the partial hospital program, managing that stress. So it puts us into lower brain. And I think these are the important things. Feeling disconnected, devalued, powerless, and not having our basic needs met. Anybody else get angry? I get very angry. I get really cranky at night, like after 9 o'clock. I'm not as good a parent after 9 o'clock as I am at 9 in the morning. My kids never saw me at 9 in the morning. They don't know what a good dad they've got. That's one of the things I feel worse about, right? But here's the thing. The top three are all in relationship. We feel connected in relationship, we feel valued in relationship, and we feel empowered in relationship. And one of the things when we struggle with our kids, oftentimes it's because we're feeling disconnected, or we feel like they say or do something that doesn't value us, or we feel powerless to be able to fix it. So now let's take a look at what regulation looks like. I think this is the sweet spot for regulation, right? It was a while ago for us, but you can pee and poop and there's no diapers, no diaper rash, right? You don't have to eat the pureed vegetables. It comes right through the umbilical cord. It's dark, it's warm, right? And when the baby comes out, what is our job? All we do is soothe, don't we? That's our work. We just try and keep them regulated, and then they get dysregulated. And then what do? We just focus on how do we soothe them, and we've got this checklist of their basic needs. Are they hungry? Do they need to be changed? Do they need to, are they tired? If that doesn't work, then we get them with a person, don't we? That they feel most connected to. And have you ever noticed that rhythm is so important? For us, it's so nice to be able to sit in a hammock or listen to music. That's rhythm. We put kids in bouncy chairs. Bruce Perry, who I talked about earlier, believes that the reason why that's so helpful is because anything that we find soothing through rhythm all falls within the mother's heart, the cadence of a mother's heartbeat. And so it's like bringing us back to that place where we're most regulated. So we do all these things, right? We just focus on regulation right up until about 18 months to 2 years. And then what do? Terrible twos, right? Then we start punishing. I think once they start getting the language that says no, no, daddy, all of a sudden we begin to show up differently. But why do we stop soothing? Our work is still to soothe when our kids are struggling. And the Holy Grail is teaching them to soothe themselves, isn't it? But the bad news is we often respond to dysregulation with punishment, which is dysregulating, because usually it feels disconnecting, devaluing, and it disempowers us. Or overprotection. I am not saying that kids should never be dysregulated. Yes, they're going to get dysregulated all the time. Yes, we need to push them in these moments. And then we need to help them cope with it. It's not that how can we clear out all of the stress in their lives. It's about how do we help them cope with the stresses in their lives and not get caught in one of these two very different ways of managing this. But the good news is regulation is a skill that we can teach them. In schools, District 46 is teaching your kids regulation. We can teach them regulation. One of the ways is just breathing. Breathing has remarkable impact. And it's this simple. Take a deep breath in, hold it, and then breathe out more slowly. Do that for 30 seconds, 45 seconds. Take a look at what happens. When we breathe and do intentional levels of breathing, our sleep improves, our digestion improves. It's good for our heart, but even more, what it does is it immediately decreases cortisol levels, the stress hormones that flow through our brains. We automatically feel the reduction in stress. And more good news is that relationships are regulated. Surrounding kids in their hardest moments with people who they know and care about them and regulate them. Have you ever noticed how regulation is just as contagious as dysregulation? When I'm dysregulated and someone's very calm with me and says, we'll figure this out. I know you're upset. We'll get this figured out. What it says is my nervous system tells your nervous system that it's safe. And that's our work, is to talk not just to we can't talk to their cortex because they can't access it, but our calm selves. Help them realize, okay, I don't need to be in this panicked place. But words are often unhelpful. Have you ever noticed when someone's just talking at you and you're really stressed how hard that is? Right? But being present is helpful. I think this is going to work. Anyone heard of Michael Jr.? He's actually a comedian, but he tells a story about his daughter going through one of the most stressful times in her life. She had just made it through the birth canal. And this is him. Take a look at how he's able to soothe her. I think this will work. Let me just see if I can get this.
Yo, comedian Michael Jr. here. As you know, I just flat out enjoy doing comedy. But one of the things I love way more than that is being a dad. Not too long ago, I'm going through some video footage, and I run into this video of my youngest daughter being born. Now, of course, I was there. I actually took the video, but I had never really experienced it from this perspective before. Now, look, we're in the hospital room. She's sticky, and she's baby and all that stuff, and she's in the middle of crying. And then I speak up. I start talking to her, and watch how she responds when she hears my voice. Okay, Portland, look, I'm right here. It's okay, it's okay. I'm right here, I'm right here. We're doing just fine. It's okay. It's okay, I'm right here. Right here, yeah, it's okay. It's okay, baby. It's okay. That was pretty awesome. So check it. A few minutes later, the nurse starts working on her, puts her pamper on her, and I'm not saying anything. And she actually starts to cry again. Then I speak up, she hears my voice, and stops crying, like again. But I want you to notice what else happens after I tell her that I love her. Portland, it's okay. Okay, it's good, it's good, it's good. I'm right here, I'm right here. I'm right here. I love you. I love you. I love you. Yeah, I'm right here. I'm right here. It's okay. It's okay. That's just phenomenal.
Our voices, our presence, not our words, but our presence are what can do that. If I'm on a plane and there's turbulence and I look up and a flight attendant is reading their magazine, I'm like, okay, that's regulating for me, right? I can look up and say, I'm safe. You're safe, I'm safe. If the pilot comes out and says, I've never had turbulence like this before, right? I'm not feeling quite the same way, right? So here's the thing. When little people are overwhelmed by big emotions, it's our job to share our calm, not join their chaos. In these moments, it's the hardest time for us to be calm, but it's so important that we are in that moment. Stuart Shanker wrote this book called Self-Reg, and I really like the way he thinks about this. He says we need to move from misbehavior, thinking about things as misbehavior, to thinking about things as stress behavior. And he talks about 5 different domains of stress. The first is biological, right? The people who have sensory issues, or if you're hungry or tired, right? That these things get in the way of our ability to be able to show up the way we want to. There's emotional stress, especially for kids experiencing emotions for the first time. The first time you're invited to a birthday party, or the first time you're the only one not invited to the birthday party. The first conflict with a friend. For some kids, the first girlfriend or boyfriend, right? Then there's cognitive stress. This is what we ask kids to engage in all the time in school, is this ability, this constant need to focus and sit still and be able to work through memories and things in our brains. And then there's social stress, and we all understand social stress, right? Then he talks about pro-social stress, which is interesting. I think pro-social stress is this idea that you've got, how do I do the right thing? Do I take care of my needs, or do I take care of my sister's needs? If I've got something and I'm told I need to share this cookie that I got, if I keep it, I feel guilty. And if I share it, I feel frustrated, right? And so this pro-social stress is something that he talks about. So he says, here are the 5 different kinds of stress. Take a look at that. School hits on all of these, doesn't it? Every single one of them, in a big, big way. For many of us, work is like that too, right? And so have you ever lost your temper, shut down, or avoided something and not been stressed? I started thinking about it, and I don't. No, there's always a stressor there for me somewhere, one of those things, right? So why would it be any different for our kids? When they're melting down, can we see it as stress instead of them being spoiled? Can we see it as stress instead of them being manipulative? Can we see it as stress, right? Here's the thing, what happens in stress is it depletes our energy. Lisa Feldman Barrett talks about this. She's like, our brains are like a checkbook, a budget, that when we are depleted, we melt down. And when we're full, when we've had a good night's sleep and we've had a good breakfast and we've had a nice time, we say we love each other as you walk out the door, and the bus driver says, oh, it's so good to see you. And the teacher says, oh, do you have your homework? And you hand in your homework. And she says, this is wonderful. There's a lot of deposits in that brain budget, aren't there? How about the kid whose parents were fighting about divorce the night before? They get up and there's no food on the table. And they get on the bus, and the bus driver says, if you act up again on this bus, this will be your last ride. And he walks into class and he already sees his name on the board. Those are all withdrawals, right? So what she says is that those are the things that cause stress for us. So let's take a look at cognitive stress. Cognitive stress, you can sit there in you can take a 3-hour test and only be sitting, but you can be exhausted at the end of it, can't you? Right? Concentration takes the whole body. You've got to have working memory. You've got to sit still, right? You've got to, and all of this, your body is still using a lot of energy, even if you're just sitting in class and sitting still. And oftentimes when kids fail to do things, we call them lazy, don't we? Why are they being lazy? They're unmotivated or lazy. How many of you are lazy? I'm going to find out. Because I want you to do this problem for me. And when you get the answer, I want you to raise your hand. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? I see one hand up. Put your hands. I see two hands up. Let me ask you this. How many people got 10 cents? A lot of people got 10 cents, but you didn't follow directions and raise your hand, most of you. How many people got 5 cents? All right, guess what? 10-cent people, or the people, anybody just say, yeah, I'm not doing this. How many people say, yeah, it's too much for me right now? Right? Lazy! If you said 10 cents, did you check your work? No. Do you know why? Because if you did, a bat and a ball together cost $1.10, the bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? If the ball costs 10 cents, then the bat costs $1.10, and together they cost $1.20. You learned in elementary school to check your work, and you didn't check your work. Lazy, right? So here's the thing. Our brains are built to do this thing called, our brains are built for the law of least effort. Why is that? Because in crisis, the goal is to have enough left in the tank to be able to fight off whatever it is that's coming. You aren't lazy, by the way. That's your brain's shutting down. I'll bet you if we did this at 8 in the morning, more people would have engaged, right? If I asked you to get down and do as many push-ups as you could do, I'll bet most of you would do 60 or 70, right? And then you'd stop. Maybe you do 10, 12, I don't know. But at some point you'd stop. But what would happen if I said, I'll give you $1 million for every additional push-up? Would you have a few more left in the tank? I'll bet you could crank out a couple more, right? Here's the thing. This is the way our brains are meant to work. They're meant to work so that there's always some physical energy left in the tank, and we've also got some emotional, some cognitive energy left in the tank, so we're not completely depleted. They did this, they gave this to students. Oh, by the way, 50% of Harvard students either gave up or said 10 cents. So you're in good company, all right? So what they did was they gave these people these problems, and they looked at their pupils and whether their pupils were dilated. And when their pupils dilated, they were able to determine within a split second whether they were going to answer wrongly, impulsively, or if they were going to just give up. Why is that? Because this is a sign, pupils dilate. Remember, that's a sign of our dysregulation, isn't it? When our pupils dilate. And so what they said, this guy Daniel Kahneman says, at some point, we are working, and we're working hard at something. We're doing all these math problems, and then at some point, we're doing all these push-ups, at some point, we just give it up. For me, like if I'm doing emails at night, I hit a point around 7:30 or 7:45 when I just can't do it anymore. Our brains shut down on us, right? Does this look familiar? He calls this an intolerable peak. Or the limbic system saying, stop, you're in danger, right? It's a little bit like our car, the light on our car. The fuel light on our car goes off before we run out of gas, doesn't it? Why? Because it wouldn't help if when we ran out of gas, then the light goes on. And so all of a sudden in our brain, there's constantly measuring this glucose expenditure. And so here's the thing. The more stressed we are when we begin any task, the quicker we are to hit this break where we just fall off the cliff. So what are some of the things that get in the way? When kids have attentional problems or trauma, if they've got slow processing speed, they're slower to develop. If they've experienced a ton of past failure, all of a sudden they're going to get there quicker. Kids who experience discrimination, poverty, family stresses. At some point, have you ever noticed that sometimes you can be really patient with your kids, and other times it's like, yeah, I can't do this right now, right? Don't mess with me now. That means you are right there, on this, right here, ready to go, right? And then you lose your temper. Anyone else lose your temper with their kids? I hope I'm not the only one, right? That's not because you're bad people or you're somehow motivated to yell at your kids. That's not it, is it? No, you reach your peak, and then you fall off the cliff. So how do we respond? We respond by yelling, or sometimes shutting down and avoiding. or becoming oppositional, right? So what do we do instead? Well, we can punish, we can power through, and we can replenish. But when we punish kids, we further trigger their fight or flight response. And so it depletes them more. Sometimes kids can power through. I could do a couple extra push-ups, but I might also end up hurting myself. Have you ever noticed during finals week how many kids fall apart? Emergency rooms. When we push kids to, why we have finals weeks, I don't understand. Let's put all the high stakes testing together and ask for people's highest functioning, all the same week. For kids who don't have all the skills yet to do these things. We wouldn't do that at work, and yet we do that to our kids twice a year. And then all of a sudden, if they get to it and they're in college and they come home, what happens? They get sick because their immune system they burn through their immune system. Or they end up in hospital, stressed. Or we can replenish, right? And that's our work, is to replenish by giving them a break, noticing when we need a break before we begin to dive in. So here is 5 strategies for developing self-regulation. The first is to reframe it. When your child is melting down or avoiding or doing whatever, the first step is, can we reframe it? Is it limbic breaking or laziness? Is it misbehavior or stress behavior? They're stressed. They're not misbehaving just to be mean to their sibling. And can you recognize what's happening? Why is it that they're stressed? What's causing it? And then once we realize what's causing it, can we reduce it? My daughter used to get really cranky. In the afternoons, we couldn't understand why until we realized she was hungry. Right? We recognized she was stressed, her body was stressed. It was because she was hangry, so we could reduce it by giving her a snack before dinner. It's a good idea to have a snack before dinner. For her, it was, right? And then can we reflect on this? So they begin to develop an awareness of when they're approaching their peak. So my daughter can say, hey, I'm going to grab a snack. She doesn't require us to notice that she's getting cranky to give it to her. Can we help them recognize, okay, this is about me being stressed? And then, can we restore? Before the peak is reached, can we get them to a place where they can calm? So reframe, recognize, reduce, reflect, restore. They all start with R, isn't that nice? So here's the thing, and this gets back to expanding and contracting. Breaks are essential. Take a look at the stress these are adult brains. These are meetings, and I think many of you can relate to this. If you don't get a break between meetings, look what happens to your brain. You put a little break in between meetings, and your brain is calm throughout. With kids, they took a look at what happens to kids' test scores throughout the school day. 4 million kids in Denmark took the same test, and look at it, the scores went down predictably between 8 a.m. and 1 p.m. But take a look, they went up here, and they went up here. What happened? They gave them a short break. And when they were able to give them a short break, they were able to then, they weren't at their limbic peak. They could engage in a whole different way. That may not look like much, but you know what that's worth? That's worth 3 weeks of additional instruction would get you that peak, that bump. It's powerful what a break can do. All right. So here's the how-to part for you. All right. So the first thing is, so what do we do? What does this mean for us? The first is we need to regulate ourselves. We need to be the most regulated people in our family because we lose these tools, don't we? And just so you know, I will share all of these slides with Heather, and we'll figure out how we can make sure that that if you want the slides, you can have the slides, okay? But we lose all of these things. And one of the things that's so important is not to feel like there's shame in our dysregulation. We get dysregulated all the time. Sitting here at the end of a long night, you guys are dysregulated. I promise you. Problems occur when we deny our dysregulation. Here are just some examples. They took a look at 1,400 parole hearings. Who gets parole? So what they did was they took a look at how violent the offense was. They took a look at their behavior in prison, how long they were in prison, whether they expressed forgiveness. None of that stuff determined parole. You know what determined who got parole and who didn't? Time of day. People In the 8:30 in the morning parole hearing, 40% got parole. If you had the 11:30 parole hearing, none of those people got parole. These hearing officers don't want to give out justice impartially. But what happens when you're sitting like you're sitting after a long day? You lose empathy, right? You want to get up and go to lunch. And so all of a sudden you rush through things. Seminary students, they're good people, right? They don't get dysregulated. Well, here's what they did to the seminary students. They had them, in Princeton, they had them give a sermon on the Good Samaritan. You know, the biblical story of a man bloody and naked on the side of a road groaning, and the religious elders would walk and have a live birth. And it was a Samaritan, somebody who wasn't religious, who took that man and got him help. Took him to an inn, made sure he was okay. And so these seminary students were supposed to give this sermon, and they went to the chapel where they were supposed to give it, and then they were told, you're in the wrong chapel. You're going to be late. Chapel's across the campus. Anyone else get a little nutty when they're late? Thank you. I'm not the only one. Thank you. So these people had to run across campus. And what they did was they made sure that they had to run through a small alley where they put a man, the researchers put a man who was bloody, with torn clothes, moaning on the ground. 70% of seminary students stepped over the groaning man and rushed into the chapel to give a sermon on the Good Samaritan. Crazy, right? And I'll just say, anesthesiologists make 3 times more big mistakes in the afternoons. They don't make many mistakes. But you heard it here first. Get your parole hearing and your operation first thing in the morning. Okay, if you take nothing else out of today, that's what you get. One last one that I think is just particularly tragic. Any football fans in here? So LSU football is big, right? Here's what they found. After an upset loss, when the team loses an upset, judges in Louisiana added almost 1,300 extra days of punishment to juvenile defenders the following week. They aren't aware of this. But when we're cranky, we do things and we give punishments and we act in ways that are self-defeating. And these feelings often catch us off guard, don't they? I was surprised with Matthew how quickly I could go from feeling okay to all of a sudden not feeling okay. And here's the thing, we make our worst parenting decisions when we are dysregulated. And the thing that happens, the hallmarks, are this sense of urgency. I've got to have this conversation right now. And if I don't, he's going to end up being a failure in his life. Right? This is where we go in our brains in that dysregulated moment. None of it is true. It doesn't have to be you. Can it be somebody else that helps them calm down in that moment? A spouse, a sibling, an aunt, or an uncle, and it doesn't have to be now. If you notice that you're dysregulated and they're dysregulated, they're not going to be able to hear it and you're not going to be able to say it. Let's have this conversation in the morning when we both have our best heads. It's really hard to do. I knew all this stuff and I still would struggle. The second is, can we help them continue to be aware of their dysregulation and their regulation? There's something called interoception. This is our awareness of what's happening in our body. The way that we can be able to manage our regulation is to notice when we're dysregulation, right? And when we're dysregulated, what resources do we have? And can we constantly be helping them do that? Step 3 is, can we just see challenging behaviors as signs of dysregulation, not signs of disrespect, not signs of that they are unmotivated. They're signs of dysregulation. Our former dean, Mike Lyons, said, when I see a student who's struggling, I think about 2 things. I think as a parent, this was helpful. He says, well, I think, what would I need if I was in their place? If I'm in an argument with my wife and she tells me I'm grounded for the weekend, that doesn't work so well for me. That doesn't help. And then he says, I always try and figure out what I can put on the table instead of what I can take away. With Matthew, I would be so angry and I think, what am I going to take away? What am I going to take away? So I can be in control with what was happening. And what Mike says is, what can I put on the table? And what do we put on the table? We put regulation strategies on the table. Why don't you take a walk? You want to listen to music in your room? Younger kids, you want to play with Legos? Whatever it is. Here's the thing. When kids are experiencing dysregulation and we see it through challenging behaviors, it gives us our best opportunity to teach them how to cope with that. sometimes through our own ability to model that. I'm dysregulated, I'm really frustrated, I'm gonna take some time before we have this discussion. I'm gonna go take the dog for a walk, and then I'm gonna clear my head so I'm in a better place when we talk. Your child is gonna learn from that. Step 4 is, can we trust development? I've got a friend named Dave Gleason. He wrote this book called At What Cost, and he coined this term developmental empathy, and I really like it. It's matching the demands we place on our kids with their brain's development. This part of their brain, this prefrontal cortex, is still developing in our late 20s. That means that if you've got a 12-year-old, they still have 2.5 times more development coming their way. Right? It's still slow to develop. And remember all of the things that it takes. Matthew could not transition. He struggled with time right up until he was about 17 years old. And then he got better at it. Now he's the guy who wants to take me to the airport because he's so on time. But it took a while, right? And here's the thing, it's the incompatibility between what we expect kids to do and what they're able to do that causes stress. The thing is, we expect all 8-year-olds to be able to do this, all 9-year-olds to be able to do this. Our schools expect that, we expect that. We don't understand. I couldn't understand why my daughter, her prefrontal cortex was like fully developed by the time she left the womb. Like she left the womb and she's like, here's a checklist, like, right? Matthew, it took him years. And we can't see it. You know, there are kids in middle school who have facial hair. Right? And we got other kids we know are 3 years away from development, but we never say to the kid who doesn't have facial hair, right? The kid who's still pre-pubertal, we wouldn't say you're lazy. You aren't growing any facial hair yet. Your body, your body hasn't grown to be hasn't grown. What's wrong with you? We wouldn't say we're going to give you an incentive program so you can start shaving. We wouldn't do that. And yet this is what we do with kids who struggle with the academic demands of school. So we'd say they should be able to do it, and if they don't do it, it's because they're lazy. For Matthew, he couldn't do it because he didn't have it yet. Development has its own timeline for everybody. It will get there. And development is always on our side. We need to trust it. It just happens at different paces, and the kids who are slower to develop are the ones who have the greatest stress in school and at home. I promise you that. Whenever we fight development, we lose. And I fought it with Matthew. Luckily, I had a psychologist mentor, and I would come and I'd complain, and I'd be like, yeah, I took away the car from Matthew for 6 weeks. Should it be 6 months or 6 weeks? And he would look at me and he would just say, just let him know that this is going to get easier for him. And it does. It was important for Matthew to know, but it was also important for me to know. But this wasn't about his intentionally just trying to make my life miserable. It was about his slow development. And here's the thing, when we add punishments and these things, stress slows down development. For that part of the brain we need to develop. It's so counterproductive, and yet this is what we do. But it's really hard to be patient. I promise you it's hard to be patient. Matthew ended up going to college. Can you imagine sending a kid who had 500 detentions and was always late in class to college and paying all that money? But we started to see him. He started getting better. Things got easier for him. And he did great in college. He's going to graduate this spring. But it's hard to be patient. Anyone else make turkey and the gravy? I hate making gravy. So what you do is you take some butter and flour and you melt it in a pot, and then you pour the turkey drippings in, and then you stir it. And it takes 7 to 9 minutes. But at minute 5, I'm always sure it's never going to thicken. And the turkey's on the table and people are waiting, and I'm like starting to pour extra. If I pour the extra flour, it's going to ruin it. It's so hard, and yet all of a sudden, if I can hold off at minute 8 or 9, it thickens. The same thing happens. I was at North Shore Academy where we had kids with significant behavior problems, and all of a sudden, they would struggle right up to their last day, and then they'd come back as 23-year-olds with lives I never would have imagined. They were just later to develop. Step 5, we need to co-regulate. Remember, my nervous system tells your nervous system that you're okay. And then we hold space in these moments. If we can, if we're regulated, we hold space. If we can't, we get someone who can. And finally, I think this is step 6, not step 7. Can we be curious? This is the one thing I wish I had done differently when I was a parent of younger kids. It was when my kids struggled, and I wish I had done this more as a principal and as a psychologist, is instead of saying, you're doing that because of this, I wish I had said, I wonder why this is happening. When in doubt, listen, because there are always themes. I tell this story, I've got a story from school. There was a kid, a first grader, who was on IEP. He had a 1-to-1 aid because he struggled with transitions. He walks into circle time every time he came in last because he struggled with transitions so much, and he would stand on the hands and the fingers of the kids in circle time. How long do you stay in class when you're standing on other kids' fingers? Not long. They kept kicking him out. Every time they'd kick him out. And then finally, one of his teachers said, I'm just curious, why do you do that? And he says, I hate circle time. And she left it there, because that's what she thought. He hates it, so he's doing this just to get out of it. She's wrong. She says, but you hate math too, and you're not kicking kids in the shin, so what's going on? And he sat there for a minute, and he said, I don't know where to sit. So here's a kid who walks in, the circle's already made, he doesn't have the social skills to ask kids to move. And so this is what he does. So she says, what ideas do you have? What do you think we should do? And you know what he said? He said, can I sit next to you? And she said, yes. So every time after that, he'd come in, he'd see his spot, and guess what? There's no more behavior problems. There are other behavior problems, but he wasn't standing on kids' fingers anymore, right? We don't talk enough about emotional regulation, and yet Larry Steinberg, who is one of the leading voices in adolescent development, says the capacity for self-regulation is probably the single most important contributor to achievement, mental health, and social success. What do we want for our kids? We want them to achieve to the best of their ability. We want them to have healthy, good mental health and wellness, right? And we want them to be connected to other people. We need to be talking more about regulation. So something unexpected happened in the spring of 2020 in the midst of COVID. In high-functioning schools, this is what they found. So Sunaya Luthar says, the well-being of these students actually improved. As classes and exams were canceled, grading moved to pass-fail, and extracurricular activities ceased, they actually reported lower levels of stress and anxiety and depression compared with the year before. I didn't expect to hear this. So what could be driving this? Well, it's interesting. I'd have in my private practice, I'd have kids on Zoom, and they'd say, I hate remote learning. But both parents and kids would say, but I love not having homework. Their conversations changed. Instead of once they came home, what homework do you have, and when are you going to do it? It was, what do you want to do tonight? How are we going to contract so we can be ready for expanding tomorrow, right? The other contraction is sleep. Kids got more sleep. During COVID, my daughter was in a stats class, and they took, hold on. I'm going to plug my computer in. I'm sharing this with the other. Hold on just 1 second. I'm almost done. All right, I think we're good. So my daughter, what they did was they would take for stats class, they would take they would ask all the kids in the school, how much sleep do you get? They'd survey them, and then they'd use that for their analyses. Every other year, it was about 7 hours of sleep. But during COVID, they were getting an extra hour. Does that matter? Yes, it matters. If what we're worried about is the symptoms of ADHD, obesity, behavior, academics, and social skills all improve significantly with an hour's worth of sleep. But so many of our kids aren't getting sleep. And I think one of the statistics that I find most troubling is that in 1980, kids were getting an hour more sleep than in 2010. And we wonder, why is it that our kids, we have this mental health crisis, right? A A sleepy sixth grader will perform in class like a fourth grader. A loss of 1 hour of sleep. Oh, now it's working. A loss of 1 hour of sleep is equivalent to the loss of 2 years of cognitive development for that moment, for that class period. Kids were less scheduled. We were less scheduled. We had dinners together. Well, my family had 4 months of dinners together. We never had dinners together before then. All of these things were showing up in better mental health, and then we blew it. These improvements were short-lived. Beginning in the fall of 2020, as schoolwork ramped back up, the mental health of adolescents returned to pre-pandemic levels and worse. So here's Larry Steinberg again. He says, do kids need certain kinds of experiences at this point in their lives in order to be able to develop normally? Yes. But there's no reason to think an interruption like this is going to cause permanent damage, because the plasticity afforded by the adolescent brain at this age allows for recovery. And that's what we're seeing. Last year we saw a lot more kids struggling. Fewer kids are struggling, and this is not to diminish the fact that there are many kids who are hurting right now. That's not to diminish that, but it is also important that we acknowledge that these kinds of stresses allow them to grow in different ways, at different paces, but they will get there. COVID shined a light on our children and our community. David Foster Wallace gave the commencement address at Kenyon College in 2005, and he told this story. He said there are these 2 young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the 2 young fish swim on for a bit, and eventually one looks at the other and says, "What the hell's water?" The immediate point of the fish story is the most obvious, ubiquitous, important realities are often the ones that are hardest for us to see and talk about. And I think the stress we're putting on our kids is the thing that's hardest for us to talk about. As schools, as parents, as communities, but we spend a little bit of time outside of the water. And now that we know what we do, and here are the things that I would do, I would say, let's make sure kids are going to have time to slow down, to pause, to breathe, that we have time to pause and breathe. Maybe it's only 2 travel teams at a time, right? Can they check in? Be able to recognize what's happening in their bodies and what do they need to take care of it? Can we be asking them to take care of that and learn how to do that? Can we take a little bit of time to breathe? Can we trust the development of these brains, that these things will get easier for them? Can we regulate ourselves first and then teach them how to soothe themselves? This is our work. A pandemic, a depression, 2 world wars led to the greatest generation. I think that if we do this well, we can take a generation of some of the most vulnerable kids that our country has ever seen, and I think they can become more resilient if we do this well, if we learn from what we've been through. But it takes time. I like this quote. Our work is like driving a car at night. You can only see as far as your headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. Kids won't learn how to regulate with one comment about regulation. They've got to watch you doing it. It takes constant effort, constant development for every dysregulated moment. It's an opportunity for us to connect with them, to help them to regulate. And finally, I like this quote. I'll end here. Almost everything will work again if you unplug it for a few minutes, including you. Isn't that the truth? All right, so that's it for me. If you feel like you wanted to leave 20 minutes ago, take it. You can get up and go, all right? But if you feel like you want to, I will stay and answer questions for as long as people would like to ask questions, if there are any. So.
Do you want to do a Q&A now, or do you want to just do it privately?
I can do it, whatever works.
Does anyone have any questions now, or no, linger if you want to do that privately?
Yeah, I can linger around if you want to come up, but is any questions that you might have? Yeah.
I know you said you would share the slides, but would you just go over like your 6 steps one more time? Just so
Oh, now I've got to remember them.
Well, that's why, just read them.
Absolutely, I love this. I'm glad this clicker works now. So the first one was our own regulation, right? So step 1 is be aware of your regulation. Step 2 is help your child be aware of their regulation. If you start noticing like they're tapping their feet, or you start noticing them pacing, Just say, what are you feeling right now? Like, what's your body feeling like right now? What do you think you need? What would help, right? And then begin to help them make those connections. The next one is see these challenging behaviors. When your kids are most challenging and we most want to get control of them, can we see it through the lens of dysregulation? Can we see it and be curious what's the stress, right? And then how can we help them deal with that? The next is trust development. That these, whatever skill they're struggling with, will get easier for them. Matthew couldn't be on time for anything, and we get so frustrated, but you could put watches all along his arm and clocks on every wall, and he wouldn't think to look at them. His brain wasn't quite ready to be able to track, oh, I'll bet it's been 15 minutes since I started this task. It got there, but it wasn't there when he was 15. And I could yell at him all I wanted to, and it wasn't going to get there until his brain developed enough to be able to get there, and then he got better at it. Let's see. Co-regulate. If you're regulated, can you just bring a calm, regulated presence and be able to hold space with them? You don't have to have the words. There's no right word to these things, but just know that they're not alone. And then be curious. I wonder why this is happening. I wonder what's going on for them now. So those are I think it's 6. I think I got this slide wrong. I'm really sorry. I can't believe it. Yeah. That's a great question. Any other questions? All right, thank you so much. I'll let you go. Oh, yes, I've got one. Yeah.
How do you advocate for your child in a situation where the other parties, whether it's, an extracurricular or school or whatever, where they're not on board with this type of thinking and they're wanting to, just place blame on the child?
Yeah, I think that the question was, what do you do if you're all, you believe this stuff, but the systems, the baseball team or the classroom or the whatever it may be, other people don't see it this way, and their tendency is to punish, right? And I think that what I would do in those moments, because there's not much we can do about that, right? We've got all sorts of policies that say you miss, if you're late, then you lose this or whatever. And then I think I would focus on how do you cope with that disappointment? How do you regulate yourself? Because life is full of disappointments. Life is full of people treating us unfairly. And so part of this is how do I teach them not to say, oh, I'm going to fight this battle for this is, you're disappointed and you're sad. How are we going to cope with that? And you're going to get through this, right? But I think that's where I would go, and that's actually where I went with my kids. Great question. Anything else? All right, I'll be around, but thank you all so much for staying for so long. I so appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Bolton. Everyone, thank you so much for coming again. We have tons of food, so please take something to go. We are also going to ask if you have extra time this evening, perhaps consider taking a survey so it can inform our future family universities. We really want to make these meaningful for all of you. And I want to remind you, we have our representatives from Be Smart and from the Round Lake Police Department, the Round Lake Beach Police Department. Here, there's all sorts of goodies. They have buttons and pencils and stickers, and there's free gun locks if you happen to be in need of one of those. So please journey around, linger as long as you need to, and thank you so much for coming. Be safe and be warm. Thanks. Oh, the presentation will be on our website under the Family University link. And they'll have the presentation as well as this video. So all of that will be there. Thank you.
Yes.
My name is Tim,
Hi, Tim.
and I used to work in Thailand.